All right, ready for Australia. Thank you to Wendy for inviting me and to everyone at the Penn Forum who's helped set everything up. I wanted to take this chance this evening to correct an imbalance, because if I was to ask a university audience in Australia who were the top 4 American painters, I could bet you that pretty quickly the names Rothko, Pollock, Warhol, O'Keeffe would roll off people's tongues. And even when I'm meeting with Australian relatives, we often get into arguments about why on earth did their National Gallery spend millions on a Jackson Pollock painting. But now I'm going to give you the test. How many of you could name 4 Australian painters? I won't especially test a few of my colleagues here, but what I want to do tonight is introduce you. Okay, let's see. I hope I'm going to get my image. Uh-oh. Here we go. Bethany? Let's see. This is the eternal debate of man over technology. Okay, where do I go? She guaranteed me this would come up. Okay, here we have the savior of the PowerPoint. Where did it go? Yeah. All right. So I think we may have to boot it up again. Okay. So let's see. Okay, here we go. Wonderful. Now we're on track. Okay. Yay. Thank you. So now what I want to do is give you the 4 artists I would choose and let you look at them at first. And of course, being a picky art museum person, I'm going to ask if maybe the lights could go down a little bit so we can see the screen better. There we go. And introduce them to you as great artists, but artists who also take us from the art world and give us arguments about how art can inform us about environmental ethics, about indigenous rights, about the need to pay attention to land and wildlife management, and the need to get painted up every so often, and a host of other observations about life. But of course, coming from an art museum, image is first. So I just want to show you the images and cite the names that were given to them by the artists and get us started. This is The Wild Yam Dreaming by Emily Kamikangarai from 1996. This is 3 Fire Dreamings by Rosie Fleming from 1993. This is A Rain Cloud by Rover Thomas from 1990. And this is A Yuck Yuck from John Mollenjal from 2005. Each of these artists I've shown you now is a star in the Aboriginal art world, where curators like me act as hunters and gatherers, trying to find the best that we can, and then produce kind of rushing rivers of words to convince you why. So why are these the top artists? One of the things I want to do is give you a bit of general background and take you to the cities where these paintings are most often seen, and which is quite a drastic backdrop, because as you can see on the left, that's Melbourne, and on the right, that's Sydney. We're talking about a country where the race and the mad dash towards urban progress is as prevalent as it is here. These are the cities where the artists occasionally visit and are reacting against. This is a countryside. For 50 million years, Australia has existed as an island, and it developed an incredible diversity of species. But I have been shocked when I've traveled there to see almost English gardens made out of the landscape, as you see in this photograph by one of my favorite photographers, Anne Zahalka. This is actually an English garden in Weston Park from 2002, and as you can see, one of those species is added as kind of a little footnote, the kangaroo. Not only is the literal landscape changed in these cities, but so is the mythical one. This is her portrait of Santa's kingdom in the Fox Studios of Sydney in 2004. So the mythic landscape for many of the people living in these cities is really about a media-controlled fantasy. And think of being an Aboriginal walking in to something like this. What is going on? But tonight we're going to leave these cities and move into a landscape that is part of a continent where there are tracks of some of the oldest creatures on the planet. There are crocodile tracks on the left, goanna tracks on the right. It's a land where there are no buildings, no monuments, no earthworks, no ruins left behind, but the landscape is full of stories. It's full of ancestral actions and journeys, and the relationship of the land and people was once very well defined, and the goal was to exploit as much as they could of the environment, but leave no trace of themselves left behind, except in the rock art. And it is astonishing the degree to which in this country there are, they think at the present moment, at least 100,000 rock art sites that date back 20,000 years. On the left is one that I saw in the Kimberley region, and on the right is one from Kakadu National Park, which was a national park that was only established in 1979. So for the first 99.7% of its inhabited history, Aborigines had Australia to themselves, but recent times have changed. One of their other major art forms, of course, was ceremony. When Europeans began invading in 1788, there were 200 languages being spoken and a rich oral mythology. That rich oral mythology was often played out in an intellectual life that was recalling complex genealogies and ceremonial song cycles. They described the travels and movements and actions of ancestral beings. And documentation with photography was very fluid. In the 1890s, on the bottom, you see, oh, whoa, I did the wrong thing. Where's my pointer? Here we go. Get this set up here. Okay. These two major recorders were Baldwin Spencer, and he was a biologist at the University of Melbourne. And then Francis Gillian happened to be a postmaster in Alice Springs, and they got together and did a number of expeditions where they did major recording in visual terms of the images of people gathering for ceremony. But unfortunately, they never learned the language. And when Spencer wrote about the songs he heard, he said, "Men sing a monotonous chant, the words of which were merely a constant repetition of some such simple refrain as painted around with rings and rings. Every now and then they burst into loud singing, starting on a high note and gradually descending." Unfortunately, he couldn't hear the words, and the words were not recorded, but we can only imagine now what is actually going on. This is a biodegradable art form. It can't be collected, and yet the value of this kind of ceremony is a footnote to a lot of the artists' careers that I'm going to be showing you. Now we're going to go to the homes of a handful of artists, those four in particular that I'm nominating for the top four for you to take away. And let's look at how they managed to reshape the images and words from their past and put them out in a way that the rest of the world will pay attention to them. This is the kind of ceremony that is still occurring today. Ground paintings, and then on the left you see a man who is draped. He's entered a mythic envelope. That envelope in many ways is called the dreaming. But how do we translate that? It's called the resource and template for a dynamic duty that many in Aboriginal English call the law. The first place we're going to go is Utopia. Don't we all want to go to Utopia? This is a station, actually 270 kilometers north of Alice Springs. It's a pastoral station that was established by cattle managers in the 1920s. When you drive in, it looks like arid country. A little bit of ranging hillsides, low vegetation, but when you see it through the two women's eyes that I'm going to show you, the arid becomes astonishingly rich. The woman on the bottom right is perhaps known as the foremost Aboriginal artist of the last generation, Emily Kami Kangarai, who was born around 1910, grew up working around the stock stations with those cattle that were calling, that made the land in what they call rubbish country because they destroyed the clear water. She worked as a domestic helper, but she was also, in Aboriginal terms, a guardian. She was a boss of her country. And up in the top you see, oops, I keep doing this. Up in the top you see the kinds of countries she guards, where there are these boulders that she says are two of the ancestors who've huddled together to keep the cold at bay and are hugging the land after a long, long journey. But Emily was responsible for very detailed knowledge of her botanical environment. She grew up in a family that would have been called hunters and gatherers in crude terms, but now we call rotational land navigation. She based her life on the seasonal availability of various foods that include emus, kangaroos, echidnas, blue-tongued lizards, goannas, witchetty grubs, sugar bug, and other bush honeys. I remember walking along and having someone in this region just take a bush that looked to me like any other, slap it on her hand, and the most delicious honey just came off onto your skin. Now, while Utopia looks fairly rusty and like a desert, empty and inhospitable, this is what Emily sees. She began using a canvas in 1988 when she was 78 years old. Hooray for elders who start painting. She developed a very skeletal, linear way of formulating land, and then began dotting as an overlay. And she said she had to do this to keep the substratum of sacred meaning intact. And this was a dilemma that many of the Aboriginal painters in the first generation started talking about, because there is a need to keep not private knowledge, but restricted knowledge to oneself. Numerous artists faced this dilemma, using images that were intended for a select entitled few, and were then destroyed after a ceremony. But in this case, they're being put into a permanent place. And to do that, she decided dotting was the way to go. And she did this vigorously. And in fact, in this one, she started showing you different colors to connote different plants and seeds. In this one painting, there are grass seeds, acacia, desert raisins, and munyuru, which she calls the pink flowers. This is her hand. She was so prolific. She kept painting and painting, and everyone was astounded by what they called her inspired recklessness. But to her, it wasn't reckless at all. Her statements are all about, I paint the whole lot of my country. That's the whole lot, my dreaming, my pencil yam, my devil lizard, my grass seed, my emu bean seed and yam seed. That's what I paint, the whole lot. And this is her best known series. It's dedicated to the growth cycle of the yam, bush or sweet tuber known as rock morning glory. After the rains, these tubers proliferate and they spread in this network underground. And it's only a knowledgeable woman like herself who can see when they just peek up and crack the surface of the ground to reveal the prize that is underneath, and then they have to dig down to find it. She takes these tubers and makes magnificent canvases out of them. And this is perhaps my favorite, because in this one she didn't use a paintbrush. She used her fingers. She used the fingers that she had used for all her life to paint bodies. And she uses a substratum, as you can see, this wonderful mirage of something that's there, but there's something underneath. And the movement that is encompassed of those yams growing, that she is a senior custodian of, and she keeps track of them throughout her life. This woman created a sensation in Australia. She achieved a fame of fairly mythic proportions and dazzled audiences. They say that she may have produced as many as 4,000 paintings in 8 years, and she died in the year 1996. There are some who talk about, kind of the exotic notion of this exceedingly old woman who sleeps in a bough shelter under the stars and creates great art. But in one generation, through her primarily, biography became the analytical model for this art movement. Aboriginal art is no longer nameless, and it's grounded in individual efforts. Her art also inspired her niece, Kathleen. Kathleen Petiari is one of my favorite artists. And she also grew up in the same Utopia region, was born around 1940, and says she didn't see a white person until she was 7 or 8. She had a classical education, learning from her paternal grandmother, who especially instructed her on the journey of one of the most incredible dreaming ancestors. During her formal education in the law, Kathleen kept a finely tuned, seasonally adjusted knowledge of where everything was. All the plants, the animals, and rock holes and water resources. She surveyed constantly. In her paintings, you see the results of that survey. And unfortunately, in taking digital images, cannot capture these canvases. Maybe that's an asset. You have to see these sometime in your life, because every one of the elements here is dotted in a fine, she actually uses a sauté stick to dot. It takes her weeks, if not months at times, to create one of these paintings, and they are mesmerizing. Here she's invoked a large stretch of the land from an aerial view, and she's taking a pattern of movement that is dedicated to a particular lizard who has a tendency to never follow a straight line, as you can see, and is a formidable survivor of all the sandstorms, the hail, the rain, dust, flooding. Nothing deters this lizard. And here's a diagram to show you how relatedness is the requirement of this lifestyle. The landscape is a shared project between human and non-human. They all share the same terrain, but it is primarily this tough old lizard woman that Kathleen wants us to pay attention to. And here you can see the mountain devil is what she is dedicated towards telling us about. And she actually tells a story about this old lady lizard who's traveling to a ceremony and gets a little annoyed because all the younger girls start flouncing off and going in their own direction and not watching her movements. And she isn't saying that, she's got an ego and shouldn't they stay with her. She becomes sulky because everyone who leaves her is probably never going to be seen again, because she is the survivor. She is the one who has the knowledge to take them where they need to go. This is another one of the paintings dedicated called Storm. And these are extremely patiently systematic paintings of the journey of this lizard who has to go through a dizzying array of seeds and sand, and the skin and the tracks of the lizard are also embodied in these paintings. It's a hero to her. Do you want to see a picture of him? This is the actual lizard. The spikes give this lizard the appearance of kind of a bonsai dinosaur who's starring in a Grade B horror film, but it's a very shy and timid lizard who moves slowly with a kind of jerky motion that leaves behind a particular characteristic track. This lizard is known to freeze the moment it sees a predator, even to the point where it will hold its hand in the air still for a long period of time. It can change its color. It also does not drink conventionally. It has these grooves in the skin so that it can collect the dew on its back and then have it slide down and into its mouth. All in all, this was a valiant champion that Kathleen credits with being an exceedingly clever, physically and mentally tough old lizard woman. She also has dedicated paintings to the seeds that she collects in this environment. The green pea seeds are the favorite food of that mountain devil lizard, but also of women who take enormous amounts of time to collect and thresh and winnow the seeds into small seed cakes, which Kathleen has said are just delicious. But now we're going to leave Yuendamu and leave Utopia to go to Yuendamu. And to do that, you fly over. On the left is a photo I took from the air of the kind of desert that is a part of this region. And then occasionally you come across, or in many areas, on the bottom right, whole areas occupied by porcupine spinifex. I don't know if any of you have been to Australia, but this was a total surprise to me. This is a wholly inedible grass that has needle-sharp points. One walk through that landscape and you will never forget it, because I call it the paper cut grass. It has these points that are tipped in silica and embeds in your skin and is totally a noxious element, beautiful to look at, but it gets after you without you even knowing it the first time around. But from Utopia to Yuendamu, we end up in a place where this is what they call their yam dreaming, which, as you can see, has a very different graphic style. Yuendamu is composed of people known as Walpuri, a community of about 1,000 people. And one of the distinct elements with this community is we know about their ceremony. Luckily, there was a wonderful woman anthropologist named Nancy Munn who traveled there in the 1970s, and she accounted for their exuberant love of ceremony. Of ceremonies that she found were at times humorous but then deadly serious. On the bottom you see the kangaroo's penis on the top of that man. On the left, 2 envisions of the night, and then 3, a whole group pretending to be marsupial mouses. But these ceremonies were recorded, and she recorded their song cycles and dedicated a lot of time to figuring out just how much those cycles could mean. She also worked with the women and found that Walpuri women painted with pigments on their body, but then also spoke with sand drawings. Whenever they would start to narrate, they would start making graphic images in the sand. And so you get the graphics evoking songs, and then songs invoking more graphics, and the images and the words were kind of in a constant alliance. This carries over into a number of art forms in Yuendamu. And this is probably one of their most famous moments in starting their art movement in 1984, when 5 senior men were asked to paint dreamings and agreed to do so on 36 school doors. Imagine a school where every door has a dreaming on it. And they chose to record it because, as Patty Sims, one of these men, told me, we wanted the children to learn about our law. And the range of expression that came out of this has been recorded. All the doors are now in museums in Australia, but they've also made these wonderful print versions that are openly for sale. But it was the women I spent more time with. This is Judy Watson outside the Art Center with a painting that you see this way one time and the other way upside down the other. And this gives you 2 versions of the color too. This painting is now in Seattle. And when I asked Judy to explain this painting to me, she took my hand and moved it over the surface, just the same way those women were talking about their stories by painting in the sand. She had my hand go over the whole surface, something we're, as curators, we're always telling people you can't do that. But she was insistent. And through that, I learned about the dreaming that she was recording. Her sister is also another great painter. And one thing about this community is they know how to use color. And they use it with a fluidity. And they use acrylics with great, plentiful color shifts and wonderful exuberance. The other woman I spoke with was Bessie Sims, who you see at the art community, and that's another of her paintings. And as you can see, the women tend to have this curvilinear approach, whereas Patty Sims, who I interviewed, immediately when I asked him about his paintings, he sat down, put both hands behind him, and said, "Get your recorder out." And he began to sing. And it was several hours of singing, because he said that songs are really the most important public medium, and they should be the first thing heard if you're going to gain the competence that you need to look at his paintings. So he and Bessie also arranged for the other way to see art, which is to recognize that these paintings are chunks of ancestral law about a place. And to know them, you have to visit the land. So we learned about the art of making a trip, which involves everybody packing certain foodstuffs, driving to the country. The women spread out to collect the bush tobacco. The children look for small animals and fruit. The women go looking for bush tucker. And then we also had time to talk about the women's campaigns against alcohol abuse, against blue sniffing. Then Patty offered to walk off with me and show me a site. And I didn't understand at first, but he stopped at a moment and was extremely emotional and said, "There are too many dead fellows here, we have to leave." And I couldn't understand. He was very hesitant, and we had to move on. And then he came back and talked to the art advisor, who you see here, who's an assigned person at each of the art sites, who are there to take down stories and keep track of a multitude of the needs. And she later told me those dead people were from 1927, but his memory track is so strong that the minute you go by a site, he registers it totally throughout his body. So you have to follow their lead. On the bottom left are the kangaroo tails. You haven't lived until you've had openly roasted kangaroo tails. But all of this comes together in what I think is one of the most magnificent paintings that now is in our museum. It was given to us a few years back by Rosie Fleming, one of the women of this community. And with it, we have 3 dreamings that start off up at the top with a U. This happens to be, if you sit cross-legged and look down from above, what shape do you make but a U? And this U is actually the presence of the blue-tongued lizard man, who's carrying a fire stick right here. And he became enraged by 2 men and started a fire with sinuous lines coming around and around. And here are the men. And he came out of this arc of a cave where he lived. His fire stick started a brush fire that ravaged all through the land. And many people were chasing each other to get away from it. But as they did, they traveled and spread mulga seeds, which became sprouts and then trees that are now still in Rosie Fleming's father's land. A third side of emo dreamings is recorded here. But through this graphic work that also is explained through your hands and through ceremony still, we have one version of a great artist to remember, Rosie Fleming. But now we're going to travel to Warman, to a region where they say you should not use acrylics, and to learn about the extraordinary inspiration of this one man on the bottom left, whose name is Robert Thomas. He was born around 1926 in the Great Sandy Desert region and grew up working as a stock manager, moving around with the cattle of this area. His paintings always surprise me because they look simple, but they somehow make rage look appealing. It was in this region that intersection with outsiders was immensely brutal. Sometimes he referred to the killing times, periods of massacres between 1880 and 1920, which still cause deep pain in the hearts and minds of people in this community. He also grew up in an area with ceremony. The ceremony in the top left is from 1937, when he would have been a teenager. And he then heard about this ceremony down in the bottom right in Perth in 1971. A group of performers appeared showing off boards that they carried, paintings that were performed with. And somehow this set off a spark in Rover's mind. By 1975, he developed an entirely new ceremony based on a dream. The dream came to him from his aunt because she was the victim of a flood. The rainbow serpent unleashed a flood near a road in Mormon. It caused her to be, the aunt, to be in a car accident. And while she was being evacuated by airplane, she died. But she died while flying over a rainbow serpent site. Her spirit later came to Rover, and she told him that he needed to have a visitation. And he enacted this with the help of a mob of his friends, especially a friend named Patty Yamaji. They painted the boards, they danced with a painted screen, and even made a rainbow serpent out of sacking. From that moment, this became a very collectible art form. In the aftermath of the ceremony, the people of this region emerged with an art form that is very spare and rich in surface. It's almost like taking a patch of desert in your hand because they're flat and gritty and again spare. The paintings are used to establish the presence of a place and some of its protectors, like the owl on the right and the devil on the left. These have become very desirable. Sotheby's sells these at sales and touts the notion of how they were used in ceremony. But they also, whenever I talk to people in this region, they talked about the wonder of Rover, who they say was quite a bloke, because he, I guess, had a great sense of humor and watched out for the whimsical and absurd, and yet tried to use his humor to get after some of the things going on in the region. The Warman Center today is where you see artists like this on the right. This artist told me that he would never use white fella paints, none of that acrylic, and he did this painting so he didn't have to rely on sit-down money. He wanted to paint to make his living. And you get a whole mob of blokes, which is what they call each other, blokes who sit and paint, many of them wearing battered Stetsons, and they make the most of the natural pigments that you see on the left, the ochres, which come from deposits on the land of their country. They're mixed up with bush gum and resins, and sometimes substances like sugar, and the grittiness is carried out in the surface of the paintings. When they're sold with documentation. And this is an example of something, a painting that's now in Seattle. And you get the picture of the artist and the account of the story, which can sometimes go on, and sometimes is a very pointed documentation of the land that this painting pertains to. Perhaps Rover's most famous painting, though, is this one. It's called Cyclone Tracy, and it's dedicated to this ominous black funnel that's gathering force and then billowing down on that point, and it's named after the actual cyclone that's a pivotal point in Aboriginal history because it destroyed Darwin, the capital city of the Northern Territory, on Christmas Day in 1974. Killing over 50 people. And at the time, an Aboriginal elder said, aha, this is the rainbow serpent telling us we need to return to our old ways. And this is the painting that is best known of Rover's work. But this is another one of my favorites, the gargantuan black void of Barragoo Lake. And all of his spiraline style paintings are usually dedicated to one site or another that he was in control of as a ceremonial leader. But now the last artist I want to introduce you to is this one, John Mullenjaw. And he comes from northern Australia, where a reserve was established for Aboriginal people in 1931. And people have a long tradition of painting on their bodies and on barks, and also on rock walls. Down in the bottom left, you see John. He's digging for the ochres that he's going to use in his paintings. And the ochres are said to have been left behind by the dreaming ancestors. So the yellow ochre is the deposit of the fat of the dreaming turtle. The white ochre is the feces of the rainbow serpent, a very sacred essence. And the dark brown or black is associated with places where blood has been spilt. Here is the rock art of the rainbow serpent that John has learned from and worked with. He was born in this region in 1952. He grew up in the bush with his family and explored the plains of the Northern Territory that are interspersed with a lot of billabongs and swamps formed by huge river systems. The rainbow serpent is there again and again because it's here that the serpent traveled over the land, making up the rivers and settling in remote waterholes where it waits looking for people who are transgressing the law. This is the kind of surface that John is known for being a master at. It's a technique of painting called rarking. It's a rarking that is able to reflect the phosphorescence of the scales of the great rainbow serpent. It takes the surface of the bark, which is kind of modulating. This is the bark of a eucalyptus or a stringy bark tree. And the rarking creates this inner rhythm because it moves with the bark, and he paints with almost a mathematical precision, but it's always slightly off. It's always slightly alive. And the parallel lines get built up in layers. And the surface effect is dazzling. It doesn't show in digital images. I hope you get to see these sometime in your life. Of course, John also talks about how he learned to paint from painting up bodies. And up on the left, you see Arnhem Land men who are given inherited clan designs when they are young. They paint the rark on an initiate to bind him to a specific site and to give new life to the ancestors who come into their bodies at this time as they participate. On the bottom right, you see John is known for using a very, very thin brush that's made out of human hair and does the finest striations you could ever imagine. And he says, I paint in an outside way for non-Aboriginal people to look at. If I did designs exactly like those ceremonial chest designs, I would get into trouble or be the target of sorcery. Tell the Balanda, we're the Balanda, they can enjoy the paintings, but buried inside them are secret meanings they don't need to know. Here are some of his paintings. On the left, you get the rainbow serpent. Her body is swollen to fill the entire surface, and he injects drama as the serpent loops around in and out and twists back in a crushing embrace of a number of people coming out from her. And then on the right, this rainbow serpent has a soft side, because this is her pet kangaroo. But the kangaroo is holding water lilies that glow at night in the billabongs. John also has kept his responsibilities as a kind of double life leader of people in his community. On the left, you see the act of collecting honey. On the right are two great barramundi fish. And again, he stretches them out so they're just tightly defined within the bark parameters. And it is at about the time he was painting these that his reputation took a huge leap, because there was actually an exceptional linguist who became fluent in his language and was able to translate his words. And it made such a difference in everyone's understanding of what John was aiming for. With insights from those conversations, our knowledge of his rainbow serpent became much more nuanced. He talks about the rainbow serpent being the first being that made the world, the mother of all species, who decided to travel over the land, making the rivers, then settled in those water holes and waits to trap people. She curls up upon herself and appears as an old woman who is salacious and cantankerous, matriarchal and maternal, a guardian spirit of all. On the right, though, John also began breaking away from figuration. This is a painting from 1999. And he began talking about the need to just paint his country as rarking. And within this one painting, the number of ways he rarks, using parallel lines, white-on-white cross-hatching, over-dotted diagonals, herringbone patterns, they're all in there. These are incredible paintings to behold. But he said he wanted that rark to show the iridescence, the shimmering factors of water, the infinite variations of color when the surface of water is muffled. Then he also talked about the water holes. The circles are the signs for water plants, a particular freshwater mangrove lily that attaches to the back of the rainbow serpent and becomes her indicator if anyone is transgressing her fresh, clean water. This particular lily also has a natural ability to glow in the dark and to attack the skin with a vicious itch. So imagine vengeance through water lilies. I've never experienced that before. But perhaps one of his best known paintings is this Yok Yok. And the Yok Yok is a young woman who's got kind of a human and fish-like shape, who's said to be very friendly to humans. She's kind of the young woman that the rainbow serpent gave birth to, and is a mediator with the ferociousness of the rainbow serpent. And here I think her stare locks us in. Up in the top you see her face, and then in the middle, you can't quite tell this, but that's where the bark kind of turns, and it's like this almond-centered part of her body, and yet her body is just defined by two white lines. And then the whole rest of it is that wonderful rarking patterning that is so lusciously regular and irregular at the same time, meandering with bands of color. But as we leave, I wanted to say that today Aboriginal art is finding its way into our homes, our museums, and our imaginations, but it does so in new terms. Images like those you've seen vaporize the distinction between fine art and tribal art, and they're no longer nameless objects coming from unknown sources. We need to know the image and the words that go with them. Emily on the left has a story to tell, just as Jackson Pollock does. She tells us about underground yams, and he in this painting said he was talking about sea change, which is from Ariel's song in Shakespeare's Tempest, in which death is evoked as suffering a sea change into something rich and strange. On the left, Rosie Fleming was warning us about the rampage of the blue-tongued lizard, and Georgia O'Keeffe on the right is exploring a lake, a flower, a shell, or a human body. She wouldn't tell us which. In this comparison, Rover Thomas actually saw a Mark Rothko when he went to the National Gallery in Canberra, and he said, "This bloke paints like me." And you can see where the rich coloration and saturated canvases have an affinity for each other. And Rothko is said to have been implying a stark landscape with his horizontal bands. But I hope the selection of 4 artists offers enough images and words to tempt you to follow the efforts of those who would champion a crafty lizard and the lands that are in their care. But as an end, I'd also like to offer you some Aboriginal words that come from an artist, John Graham, who is Kombumerri and Waka Waka, Irish, Scottish, and English. And he says, "It's understandable to look for new energy systems because the one we've got now is going nowhere fast. But it's not acceptable to search for such things at the expense of other people or the earth. Undo the war on nature, undo the war on each other, and undo the futureless competition that does us nothing and gets us closer to finishing up with nothing. Better we live together on a living land. Thanks for listening.